I'm Rantasmo, and Bret Easton Ellis needs more gay. Bret Easton Ellis is very good at pissing people off. The invention of Twitter has made him incredibly efficient at this process. But before Twitter, the only way he could piss people off was with the content of the books he authored. Books like Less Than Zero, The Rules of Attraction, The Informers, and his most famous work to date, American Psycho. Nearly all of Ellis's books are characterized by a sort of sardonic nihilism. His characters tend to be wealthy, privileged, and almost entirely amoral. In so many words, his books are about rich, attractive people doing bad things. But I get the impression that the books ultimately have a moralist viewpoint. The whole point of them is, look how terrible these people are. Don't do the things these people do. Don't be like these rich, cool, sexy people. The message might not always meet its mark. Honestly, it's hard to defend Ellis's personal character after reading some of the stuff he's said online. So, for the moment, let's try to separate the man from his books. And since I haven't actually read some of those books, let's go one step further and focus on the movies adapted from his work. So what do all these movies have in common? Well, for one thing, they're all either set in the 80s, or in the case of Rules of Attraction, employ some sort of 80s aesthetics. And you can tell it's the 80s because everyone does nosebleed-inducing amounts of cocaine all the time.
Rusty pipes. Rusty pipes.
Because that's what you do. Because it's the 80s. Because Ellis is not straight, many of his books contain a strong queer element. And that element sometimes makes its way into the adaptations, though it often gets a bit lost along the way. Less Than Zero, for example, pretty much drops it entirely. The book is as thick with sexual ambiguity as it is with thoroughly unlikable, irredeemable characters. Basically imagine an entire story full of James Spader villains. The movie makes them a little bit more sympathetic, with only a few James Spader villains, one of whom is even played by James Spader. And the only gayish aspect that remains is when Robert Downey Jr. becomes a male prostitute. It's pretty much a proto-Requiem for a Dream tragedy, except set in the 80s. And holy cow is this movie set in the 80s. I mean, it was made in the 80s, but it almost looks like it was set in what future generations would one day imagine the 80s to be, as opposed to The Informers and American Psycho, which are straight-up period pieces. American Psycho is the one you're most likely to have actually seen. It amassed a pretty sizable cult following, inspiring an action figure and even an upcoming musical. It's also one of the books I haven't actually read, but as I understand it, one of the many theories surrounding the story is that Patrick Bateman is a closeted homosexual. I think you could interpret the movie that way too. Gay panic does seem to be Patrick's kryptonite. And he does use an awful lot of product. And there's the whole Whitney Houston thing.
The greatest love of all is one of the best, most powerful songs ever written.
Though if anything, I think he might be autosexual. The Informers, well, it's really just more of the same. Drugs, violence, 80s, maybe a bit of sexual ambiguity. Not terribly memorable, and it really lacks the energy of the other Ellis movies. I kind of like the book this one's based off of, so it's kind of a shame that the movie's not even really worth talking about. But let's skip to a movie where the gay stuff has risen out of the subtext and into the actual text, The Rules of Attraction. True story, for a long time, this was my all-time #1 favorite movie. And I do still like it, even though I've come to realize it has some issues. But I think when you say your favorite movie is The Rules of Attraction to people who have seen The Rules of Attraction, the reaction tends to be, if all you saw was the marketing for this movie back in the early 2000s when movies about having sex with pies were all the rage, then you might have thought, oh look, another wacky teen sex comedy about young people getting into wacky, sexy hijinks. Yeah, this movie opens with a rape scene. So, talk about some crazy shifts in tone. On one hand, this movie features scenes involving rape, suicide, drug addiction, violence, and on the other hand, it has scenes like this. followed immediately by a suicide attempt. Played for laughs. So, once you get past the shock value, this is basically a movie about unrequited lust. The characters yearn for meaningful relationships, but ultimately fail due to circumstances or their own shortcomings, and horribly crash and burn in the process. And the gay storyline here surrounding the characters Paul and Sean is actually fairly substantial, even if it does kind of drop off for a long stretch and doesn't really follow a conventional story structure. Ian Somerhalder has an unrequited crush on James Van Der Beek, and that's basically it. Oh, there's other stuff happening, like a fling with this guy who's pretty much the best person in this movie.
Well, you.
But at its heart, that's all it is. Paul lusts after Sean. Sean doesn't feel the same way. Paul is devastated. The relationship is a little bit more ambiguous in the book, but I kind of prefer it this way. It feels more realistic. When you live in a world where roughly 10% of the people you might be attracted to you, this is a thing that happens, especially with young people. It's messy and ugly, even nightmarish at times, but this is a story with some real resonance. Bret Easton Ellis' latest film project is The Canyons, which he wrote himself, stars Lindsay Lohan, and by most accounts appears to be a troubled movie. I'll reserve judgment till I see it. I may not be the biggest fan of Ellis as a person, but I do have to admit that his work and the adaptations thereof have had an effect on me. And on that note, I'm gonna do a bunch of coke.